China-U.S. relations are not only crucial for the two countries, but also for the rest of the world. This year, it is under extreme stress tests with a trade war, pandemic, and a presidential election coming up. Wisdom and courage can help both sides navigate choppy waters. Meanwhile, when bilateral relations at the government level are strained, people-to-people relations became the fabric tying both the present and the future of the two countries together. In the middle of China's annual political season, I talked to Stephen Orlins, the president of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, about the importance of these relations and also about its future. He's talking to me from New York. He said China-U.S. strategic competition has worsened the impact of the coronavirus. Take a listen. You suggested earlier that the two countries, China and United States, are not at all yet decoupled. However, the trend is not in the right direction. Would you like to explain exactly what you meant?
When I say the decoupling is starting, that it's kind of part of the U.S. and Chinese economies have already decoupled, but the majority remains in place, that U.S. businesses continue to function in China. Sales continue. Supply chains have been somewhat disrupted, but not entirely disrupted. So we're seeing the trends are going the wrong way, but we still are far from decoupled. That was kind of the context in which I made that statement. Those businesses that are in China for China are going to remain in China. There is no question that they are not going to relocate outside of China. Certainly, with some of the supply chain disruptions that have occurred, some businesses that were in China exporting back to the United States with combination of tariffs, combination of restrictions on Chinese goods, the U.S. government will try to get them to relocate back to China. But that's a very small proportion of U.S. businesses that are in China.
Mr. Orlins, you've been working on China-U.S. relations for decades. I just wonder how you react when you have an administration and an election that's looking at China, the issue related to China, as the political football.
The next 5+ months is going to be a very difficult period in the U.S.-China relationships. What we need is both governments to step back. We have had difficult times in the relationship over my 43 years of working on it, but nothing like this.
The Chinese foreign minister at the annual press conference certainly touched on some of the issues you mentioned. And he argues it's impossible for a sovereign nation such as China to not react to what China considers as provocative acts coming from Washington. Now, we all know, as you suggested, China already become a political football. So should China just enjoy itself while being a political football, not fighting back?
It is not necessary for China to react. If it's actual policies, if it's actual things that are affecting China, well, then it would be appropriate for China to act. But during an election season, it is important that the Chinese government actually let a lot of these things just go. It is not necessary to react. And it's also important that during this period, that new policies, changes in policies, be very carefully implemented.
At a time when the two governments interact on some of the issues, what can be done now by organizations like yours? You've been working once again for decades about this relationship. Is it spilled water, hard to come back anymore, Mr. Orlins?
No, I think it can come back. I think the next 5 months we have to work to open new channels. As the government closes off channels, organizations like the National Committee, other organizations need to be opening more channels with China so we continue to have the conversations. We can't allow the two countries to kind of diplomatically and economically be in this process of decoupling. So it's critical for people like us and many in China who want to continue these conversations. So the idea would be, as I said, I fear the next 5 months, but to minimize damage. So we need to maintain these channels in the non-government sphere. In fact, where we can, increase these channels and come up with policies that help the peoples, scientific cooperation, climate change cooperation, anti-terrorism cooperation, economic policies after COVID that improve the economies of both countries. There's so many things that we should and must be doing together that we've got to keep the linkages open and flowing. So it's really important that non-government organizations in the United States, that people in China increase and deepen the people-to-people relationships, because that is what's going to keep the U.S.-China relationship on keel over the next period of time.
Yeah, I know you and your colleagues at the committee have been working very hard, even throughout the pandemic. You've been having Zoom sessions, you've been having discussions about the relations, you've been trying to bring in policymakers as much as possible, as well as leading figures in various fields to try to have that conversation go on. What kinds of challenges are you facing in order to maintain this tie? And as you suggested, even trying to strengthen this tie against the wind, shall we say, at this moment?
What's been interesting is, we're now all working remotely. Our meetings, rather than being in person or on Zoom, our track 2 dialogues, rather than being in person, are via Zoom. But what it's allowed us to do, we're gathering experts, as you said, via Zoom. We've been able to gather more experts than we ever could before, because I don't have to fly them to New York, or I don't have to fly to Beijing. We can just do it via Zoom. Our audiences have increased from maybe we'd have 100, 150 people to now thousands. So those who are interested in U.S.-China relations are listening to the programming of the National Committee more than ever. So in a lot of ways, this dark, dark cloud has a few silver linings that we're, I think, more important than ever, that more people are listening to us. After our programs, I get notes from people, emails from people in China, in the UK, in Germany, throughout America, saying, thank you so much for bringing rationality to discussion. The people desire rational U.S.-China relations.
Talking about that, making the relationship going and working, this is a hard time. We all understand that. I know you're an optimistic person, cautiously optimistic person at least. Is there something in history that we can still fall back on as reference to help us to go through this very difficult time?
There's some historical parallel. And the threats are climate change, terrorism, economic crisis, and pandemic. And what we need are leaders who recognize that only together, only with a constructive U.S.-China relationship, are either China or the United States going to be, all the rest of the world, going to be able to deal with these crises. And this is the first really bad pandemic. There will be others, and there's going to be climate change and economic crises and further terrorism. And we need to look over the differences and find ways to cooperate.
That the people-to-people exchanges that you've been so passionate about, sir, will be able to make up for that, which are very different in terms of the nature of a layer of the relations.
They can't make up for it, but they can provide a foundation for when the leaders decide that we need to move beyond these conflicts back to more cooperation, that we need to confront the existential threats to both countries. And people-to-people relationships kind of serve as the foundation for the government-to-government relationship. When Nixon and Mao had the meeting, Secretary Kissinger understood that the American people didn't really like China at that point. They didn't understand China. So he set up, through the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, this ping-pong diplomacy. Now, Chairman Mao and Zhou Enlai did a lot on the Chinese side, getting the U.S. ping-pong team to go to China to kind of begin to introduce Chinese to the good side of America, just as when the Chinese ping-pong team came here, Americans learned about the good side of China. So it's the people to people. They understood that the people to people relationship serve as the foundation. Ultimately, the government to government relationship is going to be up to the leaders. But again, thousands of Americans, tens of hundreds of thousands of Americans, going back and forth to China, understanding China. China, millions coming here, hundreds of thousands of students. Those relationships are not ending, and they'll serve as the ballast for a constructive relationship going forward.
Thank you so much, Mr. Orlins, for joining us.
I look forward to being able to see you next time and see you in Beijing soon, I hope.